Right. So what we're going to go over today is a high-level overview of conditional access and multi-factor authentication, and then we'll briefly touch on self-service password reset, and I'm sure you'll hear the references to CAMFA or SSPR, and those are just the acronyms for these items that we're talking about. And then some cool features that Microsoft has released. One, to make everyone's lives easier by combining the registration experiences for both of these items, as well as a convenient tool to use for auditing purposes on the CAMFA side. But to get started, initially, what you want to consider when you're thinking about adding on conditional access and multi-factor authentication and introducing it to your environment, you want to do kind of a review of how your environment is currently set up and where and how people are accessing that information. So as you can see here, one of the first things you want to consider are, do you guys have service accounts that are have elevated permissions within the cloud side, within your cloud environment, your global admin, your SharePoint admins, because you'll want to exclude those from MFA because service accounts obviously can't respond to MFA. Where do you conduct business? Do you conduct business only in the US? And if that is the case, we can set up a safe countries list where you have the United States listed as a safe country and then all other countries listed as an unsafe country, which really helps to narrow in the attack vector that bad actors would have to be able to get into that account. Because if you're only enabling access via your safe countries list and someone tries to get in via Italy or Spain, they're automatically blocked on that. And then pairing that would be, what is the public IP of your corporate locations? This allows you to really narrow down and focus that geofencing policy that you want to set up so that you can require people to be on that corporate network and block people who are not. Or you can set some easier restrictions on your corporate network so they don't have to respond to MFA necessarily, as long as they're on that corporate network. And then, do you have people who constantly travel outside of the US or that safe countries list? With today's world and environment, we're all on the road, we're flying around the world, and we still need to be able to access our corporate data to be able to effectively do our job. So you also want to be able to secure that identity and that data. So if you're traveling outside of that safe country, you can set up a policy to still require MFA, and you leave them in that group for the duration of the trip. And then when they come back, you remove them and the policies go back to applying. And another big consideration here is your BYOD policy. Do you allow users to bring in their iPhones or their Androids or their iPads and access corporate data? Because that way you can set some parameters on these conditional access policies to require an app protection policy or a PIN to be applied to that application, so that you're ensuring that users who have their own devices are still protecting the corporate data. And the nice thing, too, is Microsoft segregates their personal profile from their work profile on these devices. So there will be no overlap between the two. Or do you have mobile device management systems? Are you using Intune for that? Do you have your corporate iPhones or your corporate Android devices? Because then you can require devices to be managed through Intune. You can require compliance policies to be met through these conditional access policies to really give you some granular control on who is accessing and how they're accessing and what they're using to access that data. Do different departments have different access needs? That's an important thing because obviously, your frontline workers aren't going to need to have the same availability as your C-level people will. C-level people most likely need to be able to work from home or work from the plane, where your frontline workers may really only need access during business hours while they're on the corporate network, and they shouldn't be accessing that corporate data when they get home. And moving right along here, do you have a separate admin account from your standard user accounts? And now I want to note here that it is best practices to have two separate accounts here. And the reason for that being is if you have global admin access on a standard user account and that person ends up getting phished, that person who now has the credentials to that account now has elevated permissions into your whole cloud environment. So it is important that you separate those out. You have an unlicensed global admin account and then a standard user account that doesn't have those elevated privileges. And given that those elevated privileges, and we're talking about MFA right now, do you have a break glass account? And it is just what it sounds like, is in case of emergency, you break glass. And that is an account that you would set up with global administrator privileges on it. and that you would exclude from any MFA policies that you have set. In case MFA services go down, in case there's an outage, you still have a way to get in and administer your tenant. And now a side note on that would be, obviously, you want to have an extremely complex password on that. You don't want to reference anything like admin in the username or anything of that nature. And then you want to be changing that passwords every 30, 60, 90 days, just because that is an elevated account that has access with no MFA enabled. But again, that is your fallback. And as long as it meets your compliance standards that you're following, that is a good thing to have in place. And then lastly, has licensing been acquired? Obviously, everything Microsoft requires some sort of license in order to leverage their features in the solution. So you want to make sure that you have that in place, and that's included in the Azure P1 license, as well as your EMS and your Microsoft 365 suites.